For people that don't know me, I live in Minneapolis, and I run this company called DevJam Studios, and we do coaching and teaching, but we also build products for people. And we have one product that we're building. And I always introduce myself that way because as the owner of the company, when we take a job building something for someone, if it doesn't go well, I can't say to them, well, it's Agile, because it turns out the people that are paying us aren't interested in that answer. So I'm not using Agile methods and sort of never have because they're popular or trendy. They're just the best products, the best tools I've found yet to figure out what we don't know faster. What is it that we're doing that's potentially wrong? And I've spent a lot of time in the last probably 5-6 years trying to explore not can we get something done, but once we get good at that, trying to explore are we doing the right thing. And it sort of feels like what we should have been doing the whole time. But when we started the Agile movement, it was so different. It was important for us to use crazy words like extreme programming because we had to make a statement. But 15 years later, the Agile movement is now as old as the unified process was when the Agile movement started. So it sort of might be time for us to start evolving some of our thought, and that's what I want to spend some time talking about today. Tonight, I'm more of a fan of telling you what I'm doing instead of telling you what you should do, because I don't know you, and I don't know your company or your product, so maybe these things will resonate. I've also spent the last year trying to write down some of my thoughts. So I'm getting ready to publish this book. The working title right now is Products Over Progress, sort of written in the language of the Agile Manifesto. Not saying that process doesn't matter, but saying, you know, if your process is successful, isn't it more important what you're producing instead of how you're producing it? Like when you go to use a software product that you're really in love with, is your first thought, I wonder if they're using Scrum, right? Or I spent some time in my life working for Prince, and you know, you don't really care how Prince made his music. If you love his music, you just want to listen to the music and sort of absorb the experience. And I think that's one of the changes we want to make. Now, if you're curious, one of the things I'm going to talk about tonight is like different team models, the relationship between a team and a product. And that's going to sort of challenge us to say, let's go beyond being on a Scrum team to being on a Scrum team that's producing a great product, or producing a great experience. So if you're curious, if you go to this link, you can sort of become part of that conversation. One of the dialogues I'm having with some of the people in this space is, how do you introduce product thinking into an IT organization where there's not really a concept of product? There's usually more a concept of project. That's in many cases a bigger change than waterfall to Agile, is moving people from thinking in time into thinking in experience, or impact is probably the word I'll use a lot. So in writing the book, I sort of stumbled on this little model that makes sense. But if we got it done, we were successful. Now, in anyone's defense that was working in the 90s, the truth is we didn't get much done. I heard he was either at one of the first extreme programming conferences, they invited a guy from either Gartner or Forrester, and he said, the research we did is that if you want to make sure your project failed in the 90s, all you had to do is have a budget greater than 10 million, and then you would fail. And so, of course, a bunch of analytical people, we all said, well, what does failure meant? And he then drew the magic triangle. The triangle that still drives a lot of our behavior, whether we're Agile or not, which is the time, scope, and budget triangle, the big three. And once we kind of moved into the 2000s and we started getting more done, what sort of became obvious to me is that that was an interesting model when we were trying to get stuff done, finish things. But sort of the inherent problem in this model is you can be on time, under budget, and within scope, and then you get rewarded potentially for building the wrong thing. Because the measures don't really say, are you doing the right thing? They say, did you keep the project in control? So sort of somewhere around here, Scrum pops up. Crystal from Alistair Coburn pops up. Extreme programming starts. There was a process called the adaptive software method by a guy named Jim Highsmith. I always thought Jim's ideas were some of the freshest ideas, but Jim wasn't a very good marketer. Jim didn't really know how to sell his process, but if you go back and read his books, there's some really fresh ideas that are still good today. And we sort of moved from being overly certain to sort of being less certain. We switched our metaphor. We switched our metaphor from requirements to story. Do you see how just in that word choice alone, a requirement is like it's required. But what's super funny about requirements, especially for me in the 90s, is we spent a lot of time gathering requirements, and then we had meetings about what was actually required. Right? To the real world, that's super funny. Like when I express this stuff to my wife, she's sort of horrified that this is a revelation for us. Now, anybody that's ever worked in medical devices, a requirement in the medical device world, when you say the word requirement, it means a testable statement. It's not a suggestion. It's a discrete testable statement. So that's where I cut a lot of my teeth, was writing software for Medtronic. And when you're writing a product that's going to go inside of someone, it sort of can't be sort of okay. Like the right number of bugs is 0, and the right level of test coverage is 100% line and path coverage. But you don't need to do that when you're working on retail. The hard part of working in retail software, as an example, is you have to make tough choices like what's good enough. You have to sort of hedge your bets to say, that is good enough, let's try it. And I think where I see us moving to is we should be today more uncertain. And I think we moved from project to process. And I see more people that are confident that they're going to get things done, shifting to challenge themselves to say incrementally, how can we prove we're doing the right thing? And that's a little bit of sort of what I want to talk about tonight. And excuse me, in the class today, I was kind of saying the new triangle that I've been working with is this idea of things and teams, or team, and tech. Because I think this is a much more challenge, a much larger challenge than that is. Because I rarely work with one product and one team and one tech stack. And when I do, it might be a small group of people that are using Ruby and Rails or Django and Python. They're a small group of people. They're very bonded, and I don't have to do much other than stay out of their way. In fact, if you give them too much process, you crush the innovation. You totally want them to be connected to the thing they're producing and care about it. I love going into places where someone says, hey, let me show you this thing I made. And their opening salvo to me is not, let me tell you about the process we're using. Now, I'm not saying people shouldn't be proud of using a process that helps them learn faster. I just think at some point if you met Keith Richards and he said, I'm in a rock and roll band, wouldn't that sort of seem weird? Now, meeting Keith Richards is sort of weird in the first place. I saw someone say the other day, soon we're going to have to start thinking about what our children will leave behind for Keith Richards. I sort of thought that was funny because I'm not sure if dude is actually a human being at this point. So what we've been doing at DevJam is our group like this in Minneapolis has been called Practical Agility because we wanted it to be a Y term, not agile, but agility is kind of a state that we're promoting. But we're switching a lot of our stuff over to this idea of product agility. And then this year we hosted a conference called Product Comp 2016. And so if you want to see what we did, I put up all the videos online. So you can go look at all these videos. And what I tried to do as the conference organizer is get people like Don Reinertson in the mix with people like Jeff Susna, who wrote the service design book, with people like Jez Humble and Mary Poppendick. And we got all these people talking about how do we take things like continuous delivery and tie them to the uncertainty of continuous learning in the product space. So we posted all the videos out there. If someone wants to tweet it out or write it down, it's on the DevJam site. It's /ProductConf 2016. And I was pretty thrilled about the experience because the discussion was, a lot of people that were there had really practiced using Agile and Lean methods for a long time. For a lot of the people that were there, continuous integration, automated testing, visibility into cyclomatic complexity was sort of like breathing. And once they were sort of good at that stuff, then they became more courageous to say, let's start exploring this other space. Let's be less certain. Today in the class, I was jokingly saying that if you want to make the move to product, maybe for a while, instead of assuming our ideas are right, for our product ideas, we should sort of assume guilty until proven innocent. Show me that your idea is good. How can we incrementally validate it instead of saying, yes, we got a lot done in the last 2 weeks? It's happening in some places. It's not necessarily happening everywhere. So this is a coaching that I was just doing in Japan. And I spoke at a product management conference there, which was a lot of people that aren't necessarily in software. There are people that are in and around software, but their dialogue is not how do you construct things. Their dialogue is more what is the impact of what you're producing? Who is the audience you're producing it for? What is the market you're producing it into? And one of the really interesting things I see in trying to kind of introduce this idea of product coaching, maybe instead of Agile coaching, is people's trying to say, yes, let's validate that we're building the right thing. But then if we get even good at that, how do we value what we're building? How do we valuate? That's a really interesting discussion that even a lot of people in the lean startup space don't talk about. How do you price your product? If you have a subscription-based product, is that the right model? Like, what are the other models that are there? Now, if you kind of go back to the decades I drew, I started thinking in the 90s, we couldn't have that done. We couldn't have that discussion because we were just hoping to get the project done. But when things start happening more incrementally, a new horizons of questions open up for us. And I'm not in any way saying anything bad about Agile or Scrum, like these are some of the best tools I've found. I'm challenging us to say, hey, you know what, if we learn how to play our instruments really well, let's go form a jazz band. Like, let's take music sort of up to the next level as opposed to, hey, we made it through another gig and the audience didn't leave. You know? Although, I got to tell you, I've been in a whole bunch of those bands in my life where, like, at the end of the gig, the only one there was my mom. Like, thanks for staying, Mom. Yeah. So, kind of what we're doing in this situation is I'm trying to promote sort of an idea of product teams, product ownership. So you have a group of people, and we're just doing some discovery where part of the discussion is why, another part of the discussion is who, and the part of the discussion they're exploring over here is what. And every time I talk about this, I think, isn't this sort of what you learn in a 101 journalism class? If you're writing, right, you have to talk about who's doing what and why. And this doesn't take away from anything we've done. It might be, though, that sometimes people's product backlogs are sort of more of a to-do list. And they're missing sort of that depth and measurement of, is it significant for someone and how quickly can we learn that? So working with these kind of teams and being a musician, I've started sort of riffing off the Agile Manifesto, and I'm mostly trying to honor it and maybe evolve it. So like one of the first riffs is, and again in that same language, like the things on the left, the things on the right are important, but the things on the left are more important. So measuring impact over counting story points. That doesn't mean you shouldn't measure progress, but the next level is to try and measure impact, or validated learning over getting stuff done. Like some of the problems I see is that people are desperate to get stuff done because the sprint is ending. So they rush to get a bunch of stuff done instead of stopping to say, why did we not get it done? Like, let's focus on learning over commitments. Because if all you do is force people to hit their commitments, they just start gaming the system. And then sort of garbage in, garbage out. I had this developer tell me once, I said, well, what's an 8 mean to you? He was talking about story points. He said, I don't know, if I give them that number, they stop asking me questions. So I go, uh-oh, right? That's not something that helps you learn. That's a habit, and a bad one. I like this one. This is one of my favorite ones. I feel like there's a lot of really cool fundamental shifts that happen. And one of the meaningful shifts that happened is we stopped surrounding work with people and we started giving work to teams. This to me feels like another one of those fundamental shifts. I would sort of make the argument that the bigger something is, the longer it takes to get it done, the more likely what you need to do changes. So even if you start out doing the right thing, across time you can start out being right and the market changes your mind for you and you end up being wrong. And I think the bigger something is, the less likely you are to win that game. I don't really even think you can win the game of how big it is. Sort of my 90s experience was we would size these projects after 6 months worth of analysis design, and we would say, I don't know, it's 45,682 hours, plus or minus 5,000. Like we should have just started at the rounding error. And I think you can win the game of it's too big. And this is sort of a lot of my experience kind of going around the world early on and working with teams in the Agile space. I started seeing this sign pop up in all these teams rooms. And the sign was the same in multiple countries, in multiple domains, and it said, everything's a 5. And I was like, wow, that's really sort of interesting. And I think all these groups, 5's not a magic number like E or pi. It's just they all kind of came to the conclusion that when things are about this size, we tend to sort of get them done. Flow starts happening. And it's more important that the group of people bonds around the fact that it's too big instead of having endless arguments about whether it's an 8 or a 13. First time I was in one of those discussions and we had been talking about whether it was an 8 or a 13 for 10 minutes, and I said, hey, how about if we call it a 10? And someone said, we don't have a 10 card. I was like, oh no, what will we do when we have a real problem to solve? I wanted to take a card and write 10 on it and say, here, now you have one. I refactored it for you. This is the deepest change we have to make, or I think is one of our challenges, is I think we should stop talking to people in leadership about whether we're doing Agile or not. We should start focusing our efforts on getting people to move away from the myth of budgeting to the challenge of investing. Because one of my experiences is that people are so overly certain that they funded a project, that the project has to be successful, and the bigger the budget, the less skepticism. Instead of kind of saying, I worked at a place where they had huge budgets. I won't name the name since you're recording this. And they brought in someone not from that domain, but from a financial domain. And their budgets were on the order of like $200 million. And he came in and said to people, if you want me to fund a project that's $200 million, I'll give you $50 million. And if you show me 100% of return on my first 25% of my investment, then I'll give you the rest of the money. And you have to show up with that. And what happened was the request for budgets went down because people couldn't justify how they would return 100% at 25%. That is a really meaningful change. It's a simple way to get people to think about what's my return on my investment incrementally instead of can I spend all the money. So this is a group of people. This is a gig I did in London. And this was a group of people that are based in the UK, but it was an acquisition of a German group and an Italian group and a Spanish group. So not only are they from different cultures, but they're from different companies. And so what we're trying to do is build a product community. Many teams trying to produce one thing. And they're sitting together, and they're not talking about Python and Erlang and Java. I have the engineers sitting there talking about the product and the people that they're going to impact, telling stories. The technology part is something they know how to do. to try and get them to bond. I'm trying to get them to bond around the thing they're producing as opposed to the process they're using. That doesn't mean it's okay for everybody to do whatever they want. It's still helpful if they have a common set of tools that they use around process, but fundamentally it's product supported by process. And the language that I use quite a bit right now is this idea of discovery and delivery. And on a personal level, I like that language because it's really simple language. Should you put your energy into building something, or do you not know what you're doing, and so you should put more of your energy into figuring out what you're building? That's not to suggest that we go back to an old school model where we spend half of our time assuming we understand it, then we just have to build it. It's trying to kind of push those two cycles over the top of each other and raise the game around the work we do to produce product backlogs to kind of say, what if we introduce some kind of a fluid blend of design and delivery, or discovery and delivery is the way I put it. And with this group, we sort of riffed at a different level. So I was trying to get these people to move from being software engineers to product developers. So that's language I've been trying out, and I would tell you, like, to use a music analogy, a product developer is to a software engineer sort of what a guitar player is to a band. You know, the person has the skills to play guitar, but their goal is to produce great music with other people. Because we were just talking about the Guess Who earlier, and it came up as like a double entendre, and so I love the Guess Who. And as soon as someone said the band's name, the music started playing in my head, because their riffs are so strong and their songs are so powerful. And I didn't really think, oh, is that Randy Bachman or Burton Cummings? And I'm a music nerd, so you made a joke, and I was like, no, that was actually BTO, like geek that I am, yeah. But like, I mean, and you and I were talking about the fact that after that came up, that music has been playing in our head. And so, like, a friend of mine ran the Gmail team for a while. And when you ask people in his group, what do? They would proudly say, I work on Gmail. And so sometimes when I go into a bank, I say to someone, what do you do? And they say, I'm a Java guy. Do you guys realize how significantly different that is? You know, one person is bonded to the programming language they use. The other person is bonded to the thing they produce. And I think that's a tougher thing to introduce into an IT ecosystem, because people often aren't connected to the thing they're producing or the impact they're having. They're working on a project. And the dangerous thing we can do in Agile is say, and on this project, we get more tickets done every sprint. That doesn't give people some context of a thing they've produced. They're just construction workers using Java. You know, we're not helping them sort of make that move, because embedded in what we're doing is a language that's about tickets, not people, not impact, not product. So that's why I'm not down on epics, but I think like a map metaphor is a stronger metaphor, because a map metaphor connotates, you don't just stare at the map and say, what a beautiful map. Unless you're a cartographer, then I suppose you just stare at maps and love them. The rest of us flipping over on some mobile device and say, I want to go someplace else. And you pop it open, you don't just stare at the map, you're trying to get somewhere. And I really like that language of this idea of customer journeys. Where do we take, how do we think about, let's take people somewhere we want them to go, instead of let's get stuff done. Now, it's not mutually exclusive with getting stuff done. I don't mean iteration buckets as something cynical. When you start getting stuff done, then you can start saying, what else could we do? First group of people I saw using a distributed version control system, they were using Mercurial, wasn't Git. And what was really cool is someone came up with an idea in a planning game, a story. And the development team disagreed on how to go about solving it. And so because the distributed version control system gave us the ability to merge and throw things away faster, we did like a bake-off inside that iteration. 2 teams, 2 sets of people building the same thing. So if the cost here is X and the cost here is Y and the potential return is X times Y times 50, who cares? but you have to have some kind of courage that you can get stuff done. And that's like the challenge is not can we get it done, but where do we want to take people? It also challenges us to, and those developers, to kind of engage more in customer experiences. And there's a lot of stuff in this space. I like this language because I think it honors the past and it challenges us to move forward. And so that's what we're doing right now at DevJam. And a bunch of us got together and said, well, let's not just complain about stuff. Let's try and put some words around it. And so we again, honoring the Agile Manifesto, we cooked up this idea that we're calling product agility. I don't know if it'll stick. I can tell you that if it sticks, it won't be because of me, because I'm sort of the accidental marketer. Always been pretty bad at that kind of stuff. What we did, though, is we sort of captured two things, like how we think and how we learn. Again, very much in the spirit of the Agile Manifesto. And the how we think stuff came in these 4 buckets. This was us just sort of hacking at language. I'll just read them out loud. Bonding teams around products and services. Embracing uncertainty and avoiding product arrogance. Product arrogance simply defined as the difference between what people need and what you think they need. If you want to get more done, do less of the wrong thing. It's a fairly simple equation. Third one, certainly influenced by Nassim Taleb and Black Swan, and his latest book, Anti-Fragile, is called Build Lean and Anti-Fragile Environments. All of the engineering practices in XP are embedded inside there. And the last one is validate against concise and measurable goals. So it's sort of the same idea, and I'll show you what I mean. So this is from the same gig in London. This is an HR team. Tangentially, what was interesting about my gig in London is the HR team, all women, one guy. The development team, all guys, one woman. Right? That's an equation we got to start addressing. We got to start changing that, and it's pretty deep in our industry. I always tell people I have a 24-year-old and a 13-year-old. My 24-year-old is sort of hippie kid from Portland, and my 13-year-old, I want her to grow up speaking Chinese and Python. Right? Because I think kids sort of need to learn to speak some programming languages the way many of us needed to learn algebra, not because we were going to be math majors, but because it's a pretty common language and a way to think. So I'll tell you sort of what we did with this group is we took sort of a very much a Kanban approach. We visualized their process. They have queued up, in progress. They have a couple states in between, and they have a column over here called done. And I like this example because I think it's something anyone here can do if they have sort of one of these boards. So you can see they have something in all of these columns, but they don't have anything in this column, which says validated or valuable. So that's something, all you need is a marker and a whiteboard, and you add a new column and you say, what about if before we pulled things into progress, instead of having a definition of done, we started talking about how we're going to measure the value of it. That's sort of what I mean by bond people around products and services and sort of beyond that, focusing on impact. It turns out that you do even less of the wrong thing and you build more product team ownership when people are saying, we have to do more than get it done. It has to be interesting, it has to be valuable, and we're trying to quantify value. The second one of these is kind of avoiding certainty. So I'm not ripping on burn up or burn down. I think they're good things, but to me, they're about as interesting as an altimeter. It's a pretty important thing if you're flying a complex jet, but it doesn't help you it doesn't help you go on an interesting journey. It's a gauge. Both my parents were private pilots when I was a kid. And is anybody in here a pilot? In order to get your pilot's license here, do you have to? No, I'm not, but yeah, you have to land the plane on instruments. And you can't look at the altimeter and say, no, that thing's wrong. It's always wrong. Yeah. I just kind of look out the window, I'm pretty sure we're good, and I bring in the 727. Right? It doesn't work with a jet like that. You trust your instruments, but That's not the most interesting part of flying. The most interesting part of flying is taking your passengers someplace they want to go safely, if you will. And so this is a question you could ask people on your teams. If you're getting points done, you see, this is a dangerous word right here, predicted. Right? That's like if you've looked at like a lot of probability, predictions are only good if the future is like the past. If the future is like the past, not like the past, none of your evidence matters. So you have to be maybe a little bit less certain. Ask yourself, if you're getting X amount of points done, how many of them were wrong? How many here, anybody here feel like they can measure wrong points on their team? Like, I mean, just ask that in your next retrospective and you'll find out that's a question we probably don't talk about. We sort of assume that getting more done means more value, even if we don't say it out loud. The third one is totally drawing on stuff that's happened at Netflix. Does anybody know what Chaos Monkey is other than me? So everybody else just got 2 words to write down and look up. Chaos Monkey, Netflix right now has 30% of the world's internet traffic, period, full stop. So they're absolutely certain that things are going to go wrong in their production environment. They've stopped worrying about the fact that things are going to go wrong, and they've assumed it's a given. Given things are going to go wrong, they wrote a piece of code that in production at Netflix goes out and wipes out their VMs, randomly just takes down their VMs, because Netflix doesn't want to worry about will things go down. They've assumed that's going to happen, and they're saying, what happens when things go down? So it's this new practice that people are talking about called failure as a service. And I got to go to it's really cool. I mean, you have to be pretty confident that you can deploy stuff before you start taking it down. Some people actually take things down when they deploy stuff. Netflix, they're practicing this new style engineering they call chaos engineering. I got to go to the Chaos Conference, the second ever Chaos Conference, and it's all the big guns. It's Heroku, GitHub, Netflix, Amazon, and all these groups. There's a guy that's written a product called Gremlin. And Gremlin is like a service that you can put in place, like continuous integration, that will take parts of your system down. And so you fire it off like Gremlin-black hole. And it's about randomly saying, how resilient are our systems? That's definitely what Taleb is talking about with anti-fragile. We need to make environments able to go beyond being robust to being resilient. And the last one I wanted to talk about is, this is a screen snap from a product called Mixpanel. Is anybody using Mixpanel in here? So this is what we measure. When we're doing development on our product, yeah, we measure progress, but we measure impact. So when we feed a story into the development trenches, the developer's job is to say, I gotta go beyond getting the acceptance test done. Part of my story is gonna be, yes, writing automated tests, but it's also gonna be putting JavaScript hooks in to say, when I deploy the code for this story, this measures the use. Whatever we think is gonna change when we get it done. So that's like, test-driven was good, acceptance test-driven was better. This is what I've been calling like impact-driven. Don't start working on things until you're gonna measure the impact you're having. It's harder, there's not as direct one-to-one with stories. Any questions so far? I don't know kind of the nature of your group. None of you guys look horribly bored yet, so I'm just gonna keep blathering. The way we tried to break stuff down was how we're thinking about it. So we're trying to kind of help people form product teams and product communities. Then we're doing something that, for lack of a better term, we're calling early discovery. And it's probably hard for you to read, but we're using simple words like narrowing and choosing. Over here is the universe of all ideas. Now you make some choices that you can kind of validate and learn. And I like this language because I still feel like planning is a good thing. I'm weirded out a little bit by the no estimate movement. I think the no estimate movement should be called no estimates that are mean to humans movement. because it sort of feels like sometimes like the no estimate people, I sort of get what they're on about, but do you guys hire plumbers that don't give you estimates? Plumber shows up and says, you know, you got some problems. I'm going to work for a little bit. On Friday, you'll pay me. We'll have a retrospective, and I'll come back next week, right? I mean, there's sort of a difference between a price and an estimate. And in fact, I was thinking about this and trying to write the book is that I remembered when I first started all this Agile stuff, we didn't talk about estimates. We talked about sizing. And that's a really subtle word choice, but estimates kind of quickly turn into promises, where size is just a simple dimension. It's too big. So that's kind of what we're talking about with people is how do you sort of right size things. But this is where we're spending most of our time, is trying to help people come up with a blend of discovery and delivery. So I'll just walk through these ideas pretty quick. In product communities, the thing that I've stumbled into that I think works pretty well is not assuming that every product is built by one team. That's sort of the simpler model that I work inside of, where there's sort of one product and one team. And that's kind of what I think Scrum was based on. You gotta love Scrum, kind of introducing the idea of product backlog and product owner. It was baked into the language. In 1997, they said, every sprint should produce something potentially shippable. I mean, you got to look at that now historically and say, oh my God, how bold were these people? Because tons of people in the 90s didn't get stuff done in a year, forget a month. The problem is, though, is that that's often exactly what happens at a small, successful company. But I work in a lot of ecosystems that aren't that simple. And a classic one I work in is there's one product and there's many teams. And in order to produce a good experience, you have to be successful within teams and across teams. Within stories, within sprints, across stories, across sprints, across teams. And different teams deliver at different rates, especially based on their technology. You're not going to get an SAP team producing as fast as a Ruby on Rails team. If there's a mobile app that talks to a Java backend that has to interact with SAP to capture the financials, the slowest moving thing is SAP. You always have to figure out from a product perspective how to work around the slowest moving thing, you know, or figure out if you can do something about it. So a different example, but it's still not the really hard part. The hardest context is this one. And these are more things that I see at software product companies. This is usually what I see more at IT shops, where there is, you could say, many products and sort of many teams, but most of these people don't use the word product. They call things a system. And the system has components. And they build projects against initiatives by compiling components in the system. And it's kind of the ecosystem where it's much more difficult than the second one. And it turns out, in my experience, to be very complex. I've worked a lot in retail. And I went from doing digital audio into retail, and I thought, order item product, what kind of an idiot can't do this? Turns out it was me. Because, you know, there are some really tough problems in retail, like demand forecasting and allocations. Those are really tough mathematics problems. And then there's a lot of problems in retail that aren't complex math or physics. They're dynamic problems. You don't solve them. You solve them for a window of time and they change. It's like, I always compare it to my teenage daughter. She's not a solvable problem for me. And that's good, right? That's what she's supposed to do. She's supposed to change. I would be worried if she didn't. I think what we're trying to do is say, how can you carve out one of these or one of these inside this complex context? And the language we're using is not necessarily forming Scrum teams, but trying to form product teams or product communities, community defined as many teams building one thing. That's the only way I've found to sort of wield this complex space and to try to introduce the concept of product and impact inside an IT shop, which really typically thinks more in projects and budgets. The second one is a set of tools to do early discovery. And I kind of drew it this way because I feel like we're trying to narrow our choices. And it's drawn as like early discovery because I used to say we do this discovery and then over on this side over here is sort of the land of Scrumbinavia or, you know, Scrumbonistan or something like that. It's like the land where people argue about who has the best process, and all I can think of is like, you got your chocolate in my peanut butter, you know, and I feel like arguing about who has the better process is just, let's stop doing that. Like, let's start comparing who has the cooler product, who's making the most impact, who has the most fans associated with their product. These tools for us, this is what we've been teaching like yesterday, or today and tomorrow, is why are you doing what you're doing? Who are you doing it for? What are their needs? This is a really interesting piece that I was talking about before is like, where do you want to start learning? And then how are you going to measure your learning? Now, this doesn't mean we go back to early discovery windows that are 50% of some window at a time. But I think maybe it's, if you don't know where you're going, maybe you shouldn't start sprinting there as fast as you can. Like, that sort of sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but you know, the metaphor, the physics concept of velocity is speed and vector. It's about going somewhere quickly, not just going quickly somewhere. You know, you're trying to have an idea where you're going. You have to be, if you want to adapt, you adapt based on what your guess is of where you needed to go, or your choice. I like the word choice because I think it holds us more accountable. I made some choices with the best information I had, and how quickly can I validate my choices and figure out if they're wrong? This planning to learn thing for me, like the way I've been teaching people sizing for a long time, is to kind of say, what's your ideal cycle time? So what I mean by that is, if people are doing a 2-week sprint, your ideal cycle time is 10, but you could also sort of say it's X. And for people that tell me, well, we're not doing sprints, we're Kanban. I usually say, well, what's your ideal cycle time? And a lot of them say 10. I'm like, sounds like 2 weeks. It's just a unit of measure. So instead of kind of having ambiguous numbers, I'm trying to get people to use like the language of probabilities. So I would say, small is equal to half that ideal cycle time. In this example, it's 5. And sort of medium is equal to the ideal cycle time. And so this example, it's 10. And large is equal to 2 times that ideal cycle time. And so now you have like a nonlinear scale, which is why we started using the Fibonacci series and all this stuff. And sort of in the language of humans, it's yes, no, and maybe. In the language of probability, it's like likely, less likely, and not likely. And that feels like it's better language to me because if we're overly certain and we start talking about prediction, we can sort of get lost in a classic numbers trap. And sort of the last one I want to talk about is this idea of kind of a blended cadence of delivery and discovery. So sort of an emergent conversation. Lots of people have been sort of flirting with this language for a while. The way I've always looked at it, it goes way back to sort of early Agile days, is we put a lot of energy into saying, here's a planning game, handful of scrums or stand-ups, review, retro, sort of rinse and repeat. And we put a lot of energy into trying to, let's get people connected, let's pick a small subset of things. Let's try and get those done. The Kanban community often talks about let's start by finishing. But all that language is about optimizing flow. It's about getting stuff done. It's not the language of are we doing the right thing. Now, it's not divorced from it. And most people that sort of got good at this, they were sort of sprinting along. And then every once in a while, people started having really bad planning games. Scrum planning sessions, and because they said, well, we didn't really know what we were talking about. So they weren't talking about how to get it done, they were talking about what they were trying to accomplish. And the metaphor that sort of popped up was, well, like one iteration ahead, we need to groom the backlog. And that was really good language because it helped us kind of say, we need to make an investment in that space. What I see is that we've optimize the flow here more and more and more. The whole continuous delivery and DevOps space has tried to normalize environments to say more people can push more things to more environments more quickly. We, I think, are a little bit less crappy than we used to be with software languages. Some languages are inherently bad, like it's hard to not make a mess with Perl. That's a funny Perl joke. I've never really seen Perl not turn into a mess. C++ is like if it were a programming language, it would be Facebook because the classes friend each other at night. You know, complexity sort of grows in those environments. What we're trying to do with people is to say, what if we put the same energy up here that we put down here? What if we helped people say, let's have a discovery cadence, sort of like we have a delivery cadence, like a sprint? What if we said, you know, let's narrow our ideas down? So many people in here are probably talking about like a definition of ready. Ready to me to feed good stories into one of these planning games means I can tell you who's trying to do what and why. I can show you a sketch of what they're trying to do. One of the best ways to communicate the value is in the form of automation, like a testable statement or a KPI or something like that. What a lot of people aren't necessarily doing is saying, maybe the right thing to do is to not feed everything into the delivery space. Maybe some things should be learned outside of that space. So the language I would sort of leave you guys with is, what are some of the things you can learn outside of the code? A really great example for me was working with a food development group at General Mills. General Mills is in Minneapolis, where I live. So food development at General Mills is not about construction, it's about flavor. And they're trying to sort of figure out, so this is really interesting, this group gets 200 ideas, and they have 3 months to come up with the best 8. And you get that, unlike what we do about getting more done, it's the opposite. It's the subtractionist model. Get rid of what we shouldn't do, because they're pretty sure they can produce more food. And I like that kind of idea of how do we narrow our options down so we spend less time building the wrong thing? What are some things we could do in this discovery cadence, like show a prototype to someone, maybe do some lightweight A/B testing, maybe do some customer interviews? What could we do to use the language of the lean startup people in that discovery cadence to eliminate some uncertainty? What if you put as much energy into that as you put in the delivery side? Would that be the right investment for you? And that starts asking the most interesting question. So I'm just going to redraw this picture real quick. Now that you sort of understand what I'm talking about. If I redrew the picture, and on the top is discovery, and the bottom is delivery. And I said, these are the iterations. Okay? And I'm going to erase this line and say, for iteration 4, 5, and 6, what if the right balance for iteration 4 is to put much more energy into discovery and less energy into delivery? Because the nature of what we're doing is more the uncertainty of the product we're building, not the importance of constructing something faster. And we start understanding it a little bit more, and we say, yeah, you know what? Maybe in this iteration we should put more energy back into delivery and discovery. It's a sort of a different way to think about things, and it challenges sort of some of our status quo. We're sort of trying to represent that as, you know, discovery informs delivery and delivery informs discovery, but it's not something you do. You write a bunch of stories and then you sprint forward. Because that's where people get into this mythical certainty of like, we just got to get it done. And then it's sort of the 90s again, but moving faster. So I don't know if like that stuff resonates for you. I'm not really sure how we're going to build this community. We just sort of slapped it together, and I wrote a lot of it, which means it's probably filled with typos. And right now it just has this idea of like how we think and how we learn. We're just gathering people that are interested in it. If you email this, you can sort of join the discussion. Trying to figure out like a forum. What we're talking about doing right now is getting people to share their ideas, doing sort of product agility and product discovery, and just publish the content out, sort of a curated content, so people can go hear other people talk about their stories. Like at the early Agile conferences that I went to, The best tracks were experience reports, because they were sort of people saying, this is what we did, and then you could extrapolate or interpolate from that.